Everyone, Parker Conrad, Zenefits.
Thank you guys so much. So it's really cool to see so many people who are so jazzed up about HR software that they're here instead of up in Park City hanging out with movie stars. I think that's really cool. So for those of you guys who don't know what we do something extremely boring, which is we build software for human resources and insurance for small businesses. And basically, it comes from seeing this problem that a lot of businesses have all of these different systems that tie to their employees. On the HR side, you got payroll and insurance and 401ks and commuter benefits and all this time and attendance software. And because all this stuff is completely disconnected, what happens is every time you hire someone or terminate someone, you need to add or remove them from 20 different places. And that creates this sort of administrative burden in most companies to deal with this stuff. And basically, if the world made any sense whatsoever, the way that this would work is there'd be a single system that connected to everything, and you and your employees would go to one place, make changes there, and everything would update automatically. And that's essentially what we do. And what got us into a little bit of trouble with the state of Utah is that the sort of wrinkle in our business model is that we give our core software, the connective tissue behind all this, away for free. And we make money in this hub and spoke ecosystem. The hub's free, and we make money off of all the different spokes. And one of those spokes happens to be the insurance dollars, which turn out to be fairly lucrative. And we'll talk about this in just a second. But first, I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about how I got started in tech and how I ended up starting Zenefits. Because actually, Zenefits has been a very wild ride, and I feel grateful for every day that I kind of get to hang on to this thing and just sort of enjoy the whole experience. But it's also been a very short one. So Zenefits as a company is about less than 2 years old. And before that, I worked I started a previous company that I was at for about 6.5 years, which was essentially one miserable failure after the next, And I got started in tech. I was living in Santa Monica in Southern California, and I had this great life. I was living 2 blocks from the beach. I had this job working for a pharmaceutical company that I really liked. I was living with my beautiful blonde girlfriend and now wife. And life was pretty good. And then one of my roommates from college came along and was like, hey, I think we should start a company. We should try this out. And we came up with this great idea, which was we were going to build a wiki for stock research. And the great thing about this is we were going to get everyone to build all this content for us for free, and we were going to make money on advertising. Like, what could go wrong? And so we moved up to San Francisco, and actually the first thing that we did is because we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together on this, is my co-founder's grandparents owned an apartment in an old folks home outside of San Francisco called Rossmore. It's about 45 minutes outside the city that they weren't using. And so we lived there for free. And we had to sneak in and out of this old folks home because you have to be 65 to live there. And so we were just funnily sort of visiting every single day. And so I went from this great life to the worst 6 months of my life overnight. And this place, there was nothing going on there. There was a store right outside of this place called, and I'm literally telling the truth here, the store is called A Better Denture. And that was what was going on in Rossmore outside of San Francisco. And so we somehow managed to raise a little bit of money, about $2.5 million, from investors who deeply regretted it almost immediately after they wired us the money. And then we spent the next 6 years basically trying to make it last. And the first really bad thing that happened is we went out to raise our big round of financing as a consumer-driven content company with an advertising business model in January of 2009. And we went out and spoke with 75 different VCs over the course of 2 years, all of whom told us no. We pivoted 5 different times, so the business, we iterated through the product and the business model. The company got renamed. It was still the same company. We were pretty much consistently about 2 months away from missing payroll, pretty much the entire time. We had 2 pulled term sheets from from 2 different VC firms. And along the way, one of the things I discovered is every VC that I met, well, not every, but almost every VC that I met with, they all had advice based on the hot new trend of the day. And there was this sort of ebb and cadence to it based on what was going on in the tech market. So at one point we were meeting with folks and they were like, that's really interesting, but what's your social strategy? And then, what are you doing in mobile? And then are you guys building a Facebook app? And there was this constant sort of back and forth about like what we should be doing here. And I sort of walked away from that thinking like, geez, investors have such ADD on this stuff that you can't possibly build, the wavelength of their attention span on this stuff is so short that there's no way that you can build a business that can get funded by investors. And so then on top of all of this, about 6 years into it, my co-founder and I weren't getting along, and I ended up getting fired from the company. But it was actually even worse than that because I stayed around for a year after I got fired, which I really don't recommend doing, and was basically finishing off some stuff I agreed to finish off and sort of like blowing spitballs at Mike the entire time, which was pretty unpleasant for both of us. And when I came out of my last company, sometimes people ask me like what I learned from it. And I always tell them I learned absolutely nothing except for one thing. And the one thing that I learned is that failure sucks so much. You never, ever, ever want it to happen again. And I would do almost anything to avoid that ever happening again. And that has driven most of the decisions that I've made as a founder and CEO at Zenefits. And so it was in this context of fear and a tremendous amount of insecurity, with about 3 months of severance from my last company in the bank that I thought I could stretch to make rent for about 6 months. Feeling candidly a little unemployable because I'd been at this company for about 6.5 years with sort of nothing to show for it. And it was in that context that I decided to start Zenefits, partly because I wasn't sure what else I could do, and partially because I wanted to start a company, and there were 2 things that appealed to me about Zenefits. One was that I had learned somehow that insurance brokers make a lot of money. It's a very cash flow heavy business. And so I thought to myself, like, gosh, you can't count on VCs to be there to fund your company. So this next company that I'm going to start some business that I'm going to grow organically. I'm never going to raise money from everyone because like you can't count on that. I'm not going to put myself in a position where I have to just be going out there begging people for money all the time and can't sit there and build the business. And Zenefits seemed like something where I just might be able to do that. Now, as it turns out, those are exactly the kind of businesses that people like to invest in. And so it ended up being like really, really easy and made a lot of sense for us to raise money. But the second thing is that the pain point that we solved was one that I had really seen myself at my last company. Because we never had enough money to hire anyone in HR, so my co-founder and I were always doing this stuff ourselves. And so we were setting people up in payroll and getting them enrolled in health insurance, and it was never more than a couple hours a month. I mean, the company was never much bigger than about 20 people. But it was a couple of hours a month that I deeply, deeply resented. And every time we had a new employee that joined, I had to stop off at Kinko's on the way home to fax in their insurance application and other stuff like that, because it wasn't 1986 and we didn't own a fax machine, but that was the only way to sort of send this stuff in. And so that's why I started Zenefits. And essentially, as I said before, what we do is we take all this stuff, we move it all online, we connect it all up, and we give employers this sort of single place where they can do everything, and once you've got everything online, once you've got it all connected up, you can actually start to automate a lot and mechanize a lot and sort of short-circuit a lot of this stuff and keeping things out of like shoe leather and putting it in the software to save time for people. And one of the things is I never expected how fast this thing would grow. So I was shocked. I feel like deeply lucky about this, but I thought I was going to grow up much more organically, much more without any VC funding, and then suddenly we had this opportunity to raise money, and things started taking off. And we were only about 15 people as little as a year ago. We're just about to hit 700 today. And even back then, I remember in October of 2013, so that's like 14, 15 months ago, we sat down with our seed investors and we mapped out this plan for 2014, and I went back to the office and I told everyone, you guys are not going to believe this, but I just met with our seed investors from Venrock and Maverick, and we put this plan together, and we might be 55, they think we might even be 60 people by the end of next year. And actually we ended up hitting about 600 right around the end of the year. And so one of the things that's sort of like has seemed kind of crazy to me is that this company that was like nothing 2 years ago and was barely anything even a year ago is suddenly seen as such a threat in so many different places. And that brings us to what's going on in Utah. So as a lot of you guys know, the insurance department, the insurance commissioner in Utah, banned Zenefits from operating in the state. And boo, exactly. And his rationale for this is he said that, listen, one of the department's goals is to make sure that there's a level playing field for all of the brokers in the state. And that there's, yes, competition and yes, innovation, but fair competition and fair innovation. And Zenefits makes it was literally, we couldn't have put together a better marketing brochure. Zenefits makes it so easy for companies to get up and running with this stuff that it's unfair to other insurance brokers. And so I think this is an audience, obviously, that's going to be like very supportive of us, and you guys don't buy into that, but I think it's worth talking a little bit about why we believe that and why we think that's important. And the first thing that I have to say is, like, I understand the position that brokers are in. It sucks to lose customers. I hate it. When that happens with us, I get a sick feeling in my stomach every time it happens. It feels like sort of looming failure, and I know that that's not fun for anyone, and so I don't wish that on anyone. But we've seen this before. The people who stand to lose from change always have louder voices than the masses of people who might stand to benefit from it. And you see this in a lot of different industries. You see it, today with like Uber and Lyft and things like that, but even 100 years ago, you saw it when the automobile was first introduced, and there were all these regulations that were placed on cars that you had to have like 3 people driving any automobile, 1 to drive and like 2 to walk in front, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. The turn of the century in New York City, there was a lot of controversy as they started to replace people who manually operated traffic lights with electric traffic lights. Even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you saw this as travel agents started to be replaced by sort of online solutions. And so we've seen this before. And there's nothing fundamentally unfair about what we do because brokers can do this themselves. It might be hard for them to do it, but some of them are going to come through and they're going to do this as well. And I think anyone, even the folks who would ban us in the state, if anyone thinks about what is this industry going to look like in 10 years, it's hard to imagine a state of the world where people are still sending in insurance applications via fax machines. And so this is an industry in transition. Everyone knows what this is going to look like in 5 to 10 years' time. And it's just about how painful do we make that transition and how do we get there. And I guarantee you that Zenefits is not going to be the only company. I hope it's one of the companies out there, but there will be insurance brokers who will adapt and build this technology and who will get good at this because that's what their clients are going to demand of them. And then also this idea of creative destruction is a particularly American value, and I think really one that is particularly strong in Utah. This idea that we're going to accept that markets, and free markets in particular, are sometimes going to result in these kinds of changes that have some short-term pain associated with them. But there's another side to this story. And so I was, by the way, incredibly grateful when this happened. My first thought was like, oh crap. If you're Uber and you're Lyft and you're a consumer company, there are lots of people who want to rush to your defense and talk about this and write their legislator and say we don't agree with this. But if you're a company that builds like HR software, no one's going to get excited about that. And I really want to thank all of you guys in the audience and StartSLC and Beehive and all those guys, because right now, we'll talk about this in a little second, it looks like this thing is going to get turned around. And it's because of all of you guys in the audience here. And I really want to thank you for that. And when this whole thing came out, one of the companies that sent out a tweet about Zenefits said, hey, we're a nonprofit, and we help underprivileged kids apply to college. And we saved $300 a month by switching to Zenefits, and as a result of those savings, we're going to send 2 more kids to college this year. And that is the peace dividend that all of us as a society get from these kinds of innovations. As painful as they might be, that's what happens as a result of this creative destruction. And this is a really important idea that is a lot more important than just Zenefits, because I guarantee you that every single one of you in this audience, as your companies grow and become successful, you will start to tread on the toes of incumbents in your specific area. And so the question is, how are we as a society and how is the state of Utah going to react in those specific cases? Like, what are we going to do? What is considered the norm of behavior for regulators? What are the acceptable ways that we use the law to protect incumbent businesses? And it's really, really important because Utah is a state where it's got a lot going for it on the tech side. It's got these great libertarian values. It's got a lot of really cool tech companies. This really great community that can put a lot of people. There are not a lot of cities in the country that could put on a conference that is as well attended as this one. But the state can't have it both ways. So you can't embrace the tech industry only when they don't change things or only when they do something that pisses off an incumbent. So I think it's really important for all of us to come together and work on this issue. So where we are today is there are a bunch of folks in the state government who really understand this. The governor, the lieutenant governor, the Senate majority, the leader of the Senate are all behind, and Representative Notwell in the House are all behind this bill that they've just recently introduced to overturn this ban on Zenefits. But before we celebrate, one of the problems that we face is that not everyone is convinced. So there's a representative in the House, Representative Dunnigan, who is less convinced of this. We're working with him on this, but he's an insurance broker himself. And one of the things that you see is that there are a lot of insurance brokers that are contacting legislators and telling them, hey, I'm a broker, and this is a threat to my livelihood. And I don't want Zenefits to be able to operate in the state. And so we need to make sure, and I need you guys to make your voices heard on this as well. Because if the only people that folks hear from are the folks who are talking about what they have to lose by having open competition and by having Zenefits be allowed to operate in the state, I know what that result is going to look like, and it's not going to be pretty. And so, often new technologies and new ways of doing things don't have a natural constituency. But you guys are that constituency for tech in Utah. And so I really appreciate everything that you guys have done. And as this bill, I think it's coming to a vote like next week or something like that. We have a petition that we've signed up. I don't know if you guys can see it there. Which slide am I on? Whoops. It's zenefits.com/Utah, and that'll take you to the petition where you can support this bill and say, listen, I support this bill. I think Zenefits should be allowed to operate in the state. And all that it does is it clarifies the rebating laws and says, listen, these rules were never intended to sort of apply to companies that are basically what the insurance department's position is now is they say, listen, anyone who's a broker cannot give anything away for free. They can't have any software unless they charge for that software. And the position that this bill takes is it says, listen, as long as you're not making it contingent, as long as people don't have to use you as a broker in order to use your software, it's totally okay to give things away for free. That's not a problem. And I think that'll help Zenefits, but it'll also help a lot of other brokers that want to build and launch their own technology do that. And ultimately, I think what it'll do is it'll bring this entire industry and this entire system in Utah out of like 1986 and move it to a point in time where all of this is done online and all of this is done with technology. So that's it. I want to thank all you guys for coming here and listening to me speak, and I really appreciate all of your support.